Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today and welcome to Andela's webinar on navigating remote work challenges. So why are we here? Well, at Andela, we've been a fully remote organization for over 4 years. We recently put together a guide to remote work, which we're going to be sharing with you at the end, so definitely hang around for that. It's going to be packed with in-depth strategies and best practices. We've literally poured 4 years worth of experience and expertise into the guide. So in the session today, we want to share some examples of some of the key remote challenges, but more importantly, we want to share real life experiences of how to overcome them as well. So we're looking forward to today's session. We hope everyone's excited for it. A little bit of housekeeping before I do the intros and introduce our co-hosts. So we're here for around 30 minutes. Everybody will see chat capability. We're super excited because we're streaming across multiple platforms. So coming live from Scotland this evening where it is absolutely freezing. So I'm glad to be indoors. If you can use the chat, I'd love you just to put any comments in and questions as we go through. We want to make it as interactive as possible. So during the session, we'll pause at different moments, look for different comments that are coming in. We'll also hope to get some time for some questions at the end, but if we do run out of time, we promise to answer those afterwards. So yeah, with that in mind, I'll do a quick introduction. So mention my name's Gary. I'm a remote work specialist at Andela. So I help enhance and evolve our remote ways of working. My primary focus is streamlining information access and also driving digital tool adoption. I've been working remotely for well over a decade. Love it. I love the flexibility that it provides, but equally I've seen the benefits that it brings to different organizations that I've worked in as well. I put together a book called Ready for Remote long before the pandemic with a lot of the fundamentals that we take for granted today. But ultimately, my ambition really is to make it easier for people to find information and tools to do their job and really try and get workplace flexibility seen as a norm as well. I'm thrilled to be joined today by someone I know well and is going to be our guest and co-host. So that's Laïla von Alvensleben. Now, I've been practicing your surname all week, Laïla, so I hope I got it right. So I'm going to pass over to you now, and if you can do an introduction and kick us off.
I will. Thank you, Gary, and thanks for doing such an excellent job at pronouncing my last name. Not an easy job. So yes, hi everyone. Thank you for joining from all these different countries around the world. Checking out the comments. Great to see all these people here today. So I'm Laïla von Alvensleben. I am a remote work advisor and collaboration designer. So my job essentially consists in helping companies who have distributed teams work better together, whether they're remote or hybrid. And sometimes I help them with their culture. Sometimes I help them be more effective operationally, but ultimately it's about being successful in the different setups that they may have. And like Gary, I've also been working remotely for 10 years now. I've worked previously, my background was in design, but I've also worked around people operations roles and culture, and also in thought leadership, trying to bring remote work to more people around the world. So happy to be here with you today, Gary.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. I love the fact that you've got the human design aspect to your experience as well, because that's awesome that we can look through a user experience lens on everything too. So
Yeah, it's actually been really helpful because as you mentioned, the human-centered design and design thinking is something I'm always bringing up out in some way or another. So always helpful to have those skills. So we're going to kick off today by looking at the current state of, the trends that we're seeing in the job market, and, knowing that the economic conditions are what they are. It's just interesting to dig in a little bit deeper. So we looked at a survey actually that came out last year from Gartner. And they were interviewing CIOs, and what came out of it was that 52% of CIOs, a little bit over half, agree that there's definitely more competition these days on the job market. In order to find qualified candidates, it's going to take them a little bit more to attract that talent. There's also a barrier to adopting emerging technologies in which they believe is due to this talent shortage. And that's over half, right? That's 64% of the people who responded to the survey. And at the same time, to kind of overcome these challenges, companies are starting to look more into hiring remote employees, but also in a borderless way. So looking beyond their actual borders, beyond their regions, and seeing maybe what are also the legal aspects of that, trying to bridge the skills gaps by looking beyond what they're usually looking at.
Yeah, and that's super fascinating. I think, like, as you outlined there, remote work is only going to continue to grow, but you're right, there's key challenges, and hopefully during the webinar we can touch upon some of those. But the opportunities there for most organizations to really tap into a much broader talent pool. So yeah, there's some conflicting stuff out there as well. So it'll be good to get into that as we go along. I think the main thing and the main message is it's going to continue to grow with remote work. And I think with that brings so much flexibility for people, but really a great opportunity for organizations if they can overcome some of those kind of barriers as well. Our data kind of validates everything that Laïla was talking about there, the growth of remote. It's clear the landscape is changing and the opportunity is there for remote work advantages to be brought to the surface. I think what's fascinating about the information we gathered last year was over a quarter of tech workers expect to be remote at least. What's more interesting from my perspective is enterprises are saying that will remain the same, but more likely to grow. So it's pretty clear that that's an opportunity to really tackle those talent shortages, but also up level when it comes to cultural and looking at products through a completely different lens, which I think is super exciting. So what we also wanted to do was, we love data. It's a good way of validating things. There's probably not enough data out there. So we put out a LinkedIn poll over the last couple of weeks, just ahead of this session. Before I jump into the answers, this is where I'd love you guys to join in the chat. Let us know what you think about the answers. We asked, what are your biggest barriers to hiring globally remote talent? So maybe you agree with what you see in the results, or perhaps there's something that you expected to be up there that's not there. But it'd be great to maybe come back to the chat and see if there's any questions. So I think from my perspective, working like over 10 years in remote, like the number one concern that always rears its head is trust. Laïla, you'll probably be the same. You've seen that quite a lot. So I don't think it's a big surprise that's coming out number one.
I'm not surprised at all, to be honest. It's something that I used to say already 10 years ago. I think it's diminished a little bit, by some extent, but it's still a problem. And I think part of that is by the fact that, managers are not really trained to be good managers in a remote environment or in a hybrid environment. That's just not the way we're educating managers for the time being. So if you're used to being in the office and managing from that perspective, once you're in a completely different environment, you're going to come across challenges and thinking, okay, well, are people actually doing the job that they're supposed to do if they're working from home or from a co-working? And I think it's really to do with also collaboration best practices that are not put into place to reassure not just the manager, but also the rest of the team, because you can also have your peers who don't trust that you're getting work done. And it's just basically a lot of alignment that is needed to overcome those concerns around collaboration.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's like one of the most important things is almost like relearning, or it's not relearning, but learning new ways to like create visibility and transparency. So obviously office proximity was all about visibility. Not saying it was visibility over productivity, but with remote work, like it's pretty clear that you can see the outcomes as well, which is great. Number 2 and 3 were really good from a personal level from Andela, because if you look at legal and compliance hurdles and access to remote talent, that's literally why Andela exists. So we can help provide access to remote talent, and we can also take care of all of those legal and compliance hurdles, which is something that people do get quite anxious about. So no hard sell on that, but get in touch. We also wanted to touch on the final point, which was really around return to office policies, which I'll be honest, like reading the stuff that I've read over the last 6 months and just the feedback that I'm getting, return to office mandates I expect it to be higher. So what are your kind of thoughts, Laïla? Is it the same? And what do you think about like the mandated return to office and the impact on remote?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see so many companies asking their employees to come back to the office. I honestly expected this percentage to be higher than what we're seeing on the screen now, because I am hearing about quite a few companies, especially larger enterprises, asking their companies come back. But today, for example, I was speaking to a friend who works at a very large company that have hundreds of thousands of employees, and she was saying there is no turning back. So it's really interesting, depending on who you speak to, what's happening. But there is a backlash. I am sensing that usually when CEOs or any kind of executive is asking their employees to come back, I am sensing that most employees are unhappy about any kind of obligation to return. By the way, I'm also looking at the chat. I've seen some people talk about remote work culture being like the major issue, so that kind of matches what we've been showing today.
I think Liberty's mentioned that in the chat, and I think also Merlin said that legal and compliance can seem very overwhelming and a nightmare, but it's actually fairly simple once you start to get into it, which we agree. I think there's just that anxiety that exists. But yeah, no, I totally echo your thoughts on return to office mandates. I also think a lot of organizations are not thinking it from an intentional perspective, how to create intentional in-person. And I know that some of the examples you're going to give will touch on that, which is good. So I'll not create any spoilers there. But I think that's super important, but also just how much you limit yourself when you have that proximity, and the impact on proximity bias and different things as well. So I think as much as organizations can be, and I appreciate it's difficult where they've invested in real estate, etc., but to really become more borderless and distributed, it's going to open up their talent pools as well.
Absolutely.
Cool. So let's get into the case studies. So what we're going to do here is, like we touched on there, remote is less about where, it's about how you work. I think we've touched on that through the challenges that have come through. So this next portion, Laïla and I are going to bring to life some real examples from our experience over the last decade, really on where some of the organizations that we work with or worked in have navigated some of these problems and how they've overcome them as well. So I'll let you lead on these ones, Laïla. Andela.
Yes, and on that note, before I even start, I just want to say, if you are experiencing challenges right now, just know that you're not alone, because Gary and I hear and experience so many challenges all the time. That's why we're here to also reassure you and show you some interesting and hopefully inspiring stories that will help you out. So the first thing that I wanted to share is, as a case study, is a problem that one of the organizations that I worked at was facing. So this company was growing very fast. And as we were growing, essentially we were hiring more and more people from a completely different region in the world. So we had a hub. We had people working remotely, but we're hiring more people from different regions. And these new people were also bringing their ways of working from their previous companies and their previous organizational cultures, and not really being curious about how are things done here, right? Because they're just bringing their own ways of working. And slowly that started creating a disconnect between the new hires and the existing employees. And this kind of grew and started creating really a rift, like an us versus them, And so this was specifically in the engineering department, although maybe there were ripples of that felt across the company. So at one point, the engineering leaders decided to come together in person for a 5-day offsite. And the purpose of this offsite was to get to know each other. And the way it was structured was those 2.5 days of actual work, and then 2 days of more social bonding activities. And during those work days, that's what they actually started with. They started identifying bottlenecks in their department and across the different teams within the engineering department. And so by identifying the bottlenecks and also, being able to really just focus on that without any other distractions, they started also noticing, okay, here's some ways that we could solve these problems, but also seeing each other more as human beings. So not just a job title, right? You're not just this role, this person that you see on your instant messaging platform. So the other additional thing I want to add on this is that there was one person at this offsite who was in a similar role as mine in an operations team. So she was bringing along her skills in project management and culture and communication. So she was not a technical person by all means. And by having her there as well, she was able to bring that communication together among everyone, and also explain things that are usually very technical in a more simple way. And the more technical people also had a lot of value for what she was doing, right? Because it's so easy to get just bogged into the technical side of things. So she was truly the glue that connected everyone as well. And that helped afterwards. The result was that, they were able to continue building better relationships across the department. And that continued afterwards as well.
Yeah, and I love that because, like you said, I think from an engineering perspective, there's a bit of a stigma of you get so bogged down in the technical details. So the fact that someone's come in and they're diverse in mind and experience, and they can actually articulate things in layman's terms for other people, I think it's really powerful for engineering teams as well because they can see through a different lens. So, love that example.
I'm seeing also a comment here from Merlin, which is very interesting, that maybe the disconnect was due to the poor onboarding process. And I agree. And I would say this isn't to justify it, but when a company is experiencing really fast growth, the problem is that, and I'll come to that later, is that there was almost no time for doing proper onboarding because he had to do work and so many hiring interviews, and we were hiring, multiple people a week. That's how fast the company was growing. So yes, the onboarding was definitely could have had some improvements.
Great. And talking of onboarding.
Talking about onboarding. So there we go. So basically part of what I was just saying is as the company was growing so fast and there were so many, managers pulled into hiring interviews and almost like a small number of people actually doing the work. The problem with that, the consequence of that was the documentation of how this engineering team had to work wasn't being updated always, or at least it would show like what the process was, but it wouldn't explain why. And so the new people coming and joining this engineering department didn't even understand like, why are we doing things the way that we're doing, right? So eventually this created more problems. So thankfully, after the offsite, which was super helpful for the leaders to identify those bottlenecks, they assembled mixed teams to solve the issues together in that documentation. When I say mix, it's a mix of people with different expertise from different teams, but also from different geographical locations. So it really kind of blended everybody in together more. And as a result of that, as they were actually solving problems and improving the documentation, which consequently improved the onboarding, more trust was built among the teams, and the leaders themselves were able to realize that, okay, we need to look at the bigger picture here, not just each leader focusing on their team, but see how could we work together more often cross-functionally and have a more holistic mindset.
Yeah, I love that. And I think one of the questions I was going to ask, so Merlin touched on, and you mentioned the speed of the onboarding in the previous example. So when onboarding and when the recruitment process isn't having to go at that pace, from what you've experienced, like when onboarding remote talent, is there anything you've experienced or you'd recommend trying to establish kind of early to set that collaborative tone? Or is it along the lines of like you've sort of outlined here?
Yeah, I think that a lot could be done earlier. One of the things that we had also was having a buddy in the same department. So maybe when you join the company, you go through your onboarding process, but there's somebody that's assigned to you right away that you can go to for questions. Ideally, somebody who's been there for longer than you have. And then you also have your onboarding buddy, who is somebody who's joined at the same time as you. You can only do that when you have large cohorts of people joining at the same time.
Yeah, and I'm just noticing perfect timing, Crystal, there in the chat mentioning that having a buddy for new employees to help with culture. So we've definitely not like synced this up. It feels like it a little bit, but it's nice that
I didn't even see that comment, so thank you, Crystal.
It's nice that we're in sync with the audience. I think one of the I loved something I saw from an onboarding perspective a number of years ago, and don't get me wrong, not every company can kind of afford to invest in this, but the last team you joined was a team that you were recruited for in the company. So they had like an 8-week buddy program where you went and spent time in every other department and team to understand fully how all the workflows came together. And I really loved that idea. And like the people who went through it that I knew said it added so much value to them. But at the same time, I do want to caveat that not everyone can put that type of investment in place. So yeah. Cool. So I'm going to go on to the lovely topic of digital tools and streamlining these. So when people talk about remote, like I get asked so often, what are the best tools? What are the best tools? And the focus is very much on the tools. And they're always surprised because my mantra, I even used to have a t-shirt that said this, the tool is not the goal. And what I meant by that was that you really need to focus on what are the jobs to be done, what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve, the workflows, how can you reimagine them to make them more efficient? Because what I try to say is there's always a technical solution. Typically, there's always one, 99% of the time. So in this example, I was working with a really large organization, and it was hybrid with some remote teams, because it was a number of years ago. But one of the experiences and the problems that existed was that there were so many tools in the organization and they were all disconnected. There was pretty much information everywhere. And I think people can resonate with this. There was an HR tool that had some policies and processes. There was an L&D tool with some information. There was an intranet. There was team sites. And none of these were integrated. And it was quite an overwhelming kind of experience to start with around how do we try and solve this. But the core problem was like, how can we identify some of the quick wins and some of the things that we can solve? So as we started to put it together, we were like, okay, our mission here is how do we make it simpler for people just to find the information they need, number one, and the tools. And then also, how do we streamline the core tools that the organization are using? Because we're mindful that if you're in a development or a design team, you might have multiple tools. That's understandable. But if you're talking about communication, collaboration, if you're talking about task and project management, knowledge management, meetings, there is a way to consolidate those. So we undertook some research, and the primary reason for that was what are the jobs to be done? So meeting with all the departments and also some of the end users, doing sessions to really gather what are their expectations, what are their primary goals. Typically, people wanted to know three things: where do I go to get the information I need? Where do I get access to tools? And where do I go to find news about what's relevant to me? So we were able to really simplify that down. We also audited all the digital tools across the organization. And that wasn't with a fear factor, because I think a lot of IT teams do this kind of survey of what tool you're using so I can turn it off. We went with a method of tell us what you're using so we can better understand why you're using that tool. And have we got something that potentially we don't have in our existing tool set, or that we can change there? So we put together a team. We gave it a terrible name. It was called People Digital Tools. It sounds awful, but what we also did purposely was we took that team out of the IT function. We often found that the IT function were sort of collaborated with just to like make sure that the technical aspects were okay and security was okay. But to your background, Laïla, they typically didn't look at it from an end user experience, or how does it integrate with the broader user experience. So what we proposed was to put this team in under the chief people officer, so that everything we were doing was through the lens of user experience. What we were also able to do is map the end-to-end employee journey. So we looked at not just onboarding, we looked at pre-boarding, onboarding, in-life, exit, alumni. And we started to map out, well, what are the jobs to be done and the workflows across all of those points? And also, what are the tools that people are using to facilitate that? And that just allowed us to get to a point of our roadmap of how do we start to tackle this? How do we streamline the tools? That was easy from an IT perspective, because we were able to say to them, okay, we've got a department here that are using Trello, Planner, and Asana all at the same time to do their project management. So how do we consolidate that into a core? There's still some enhancements, there's still some alternatives from time to time. So we worked really closely with each of those functions. Sometimes there was resistance because some people preferred Trello to Asana. So when we had made a decision, there was an education part. But we really streamlined that down, so the organization knew for each core category what was the optimum tool to use. And that really helped us, because then we could start to consolidate the information. The secondary part, which was probably the most important, was intentional documentation, which I think most people understand. It's talked about a lot in the remote world, but it is like the superpower of remote. So if you can get the documentation right and you can get it accurate and easily accessible, it just makes crossing time zones, cultures so much simpler, and people can find the information they need. So we were able to do that. And once we were able to do that, we could then go back to the business and showcase some of the improvements. So when we were doing our research, you'll see on the screen, like employees were actually losing over 30% of their time just trying to find information and tools to do their job. But also on top of that, the employee engagement wasn't great. So people joining the company just felt all this friction and frustration when they're trying to access information. So by us building this kind of single user interface, making sure that the tools were aligned and they were connected. So if you search for something, it would search across. We made sure that each department had multiple people responsible for that content, making sure it's up to date and accurate. In this day and age, there's some awesome tools out there that will actually help with that. But it made such a difference. Employee engagement score really jumped significantly. But more importantly, people were able to repurpose the time that they'd saved, not only for deep focus work, which improved the productivity and improved the efficiencies of the teams, but more importantly, from my perspective, was just like the work-life harmony. Like they were able to find, I don't like the word balance, which is why I use harmony, but they were able to find much more harmony with that as well. So yeah, I'll get really passionate about this topic, so apologies if I like run away with it, but yeah, I think it's super important, and it can feel so overwhelming at first. So, but what I would say is this was an example where we were able to break it down, deliver it in small chunks and small pieces, and then show the value of it as well.
I love that you had that human-centered approach to it. And I was going to ask you, which team, was it IT, was it HR, people ops, and then you actually created your own committee. So you answered the question.
Yeah, and
I'm also seeing in the, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say, we'll jump over because I think there's some good comments, but I was just going to say the advantage of putting in a people team was it took that lens off the tool. Because what you found before was L&D had their own budget, HR had their own budget. They would go and decide what tool they wanted, but not think of that broader experience. By creating that team, people had to come into that team to say, hey, this is what we want to achieve. We could look at the existing tools, map it to it. But one of the other things I didn't really touch on there was a lot of companies turn on tools and then they don't invest the time in driving the adoption of it and helping people understand how it helps. We actually created a role for that. It had a fancy title. It was called an adoption evangelist. Most people would have just called it a business partner, but that's not me. And then that partner was able to go in and understand what people are trying to work towards, but also showcase how does this tool really maximize what you're trying to do as well. So I'm going to pause there and jump over to the chat because I'm conscious of time. Okay, so
I was just seeing some people mentioning Notion, Confluence, and absolutely there are a lot of knowledge bases that can be used.
Yeah, and I think the thing to think of is you've probably heard the term a notion of Notion, and you've probably heard lots of things like that. So again, that comes back to the tool is the goals, is not the goal. So these tools will achieve what you want to achieve, but you have to be intentional about curating the content, making sure it's accurate, maintaining it as well, and that takes some time and importance to create that intention.
Yeah.
Okay, so conscious of time, I think the common themes align, like the digital tools and establishing a single source of truth. And you've touched brilliantly on making time to connect as a team. I want to just get this in at the end because I did promise I'd do this. So our guide to remote work, as I mentioned at the start of the session, we've poured all of our experience into this. So you can either scan the QR code on the screen or you can download it. I'm conscious there's lots of remote articles, there's tons of content out there over the last few years, but I think what really sets our guide apart is it's so comprehensive. It touches on topics that a lot of content doesn't around legal and compliance and security. But the biggest thing is it's really actionable. We've got checklists at the end of every section that you can really put into practice, and you've also got solutions on how to scale remote work. So we'd really love you to go away, download it, read it, and let us know what you think. And we'll hopefully be doing a lot more webinars based off of some of the topics as well. I think, Laila, we're ran out of time. We've got about 50 seconds left. So I just want to thank you for coming along and being the co-host today and just sharing some of that amazing expertise. I'm conscious we probably didn't get to all of the questions. I get too excited about digital tools and adoption and single source of truth. But I just want to thank everyone that's came along today, and we'll definitely come into the chat and we'll answer any of these questions and pick up any of these points at the end. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I love hearing different perspectives and different stories. There's always something to learn. So I hope everybody took something away from today's session. And hopefully we'll see you at the future webinars.
Yeah. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.